Hello, this is Dr. Anthony Delmont. Today we're going to start talking about how we assess customer needs and what makes customers tick. By the end of this lecture, you should be able to understand some of the techniques we use in assessing customer preferences. You should be able to discuss the different types of market research, as well as their strengths and weaknesses. You should be able to identify decision-making processes, the level of engagement required for customers, and apply that to various contexts, and you should be able to describe some of the key personality types. We'll discuss those as we go through. In the sales context, we often think of the individual level, where a salesperson is dealing with an individual, but it's very useful when assessing customer needs to think about the aggregate level as well. One of the main components of marketing in general deals with trying to aggregate customer behavior and customer preferences. So it's really important to know what customers want generally, as well as what you can do to influence individual buyers. There are two broad categories for assessing buyers' needs and preferences. We can look at this in terms of observational data, where we're doing it non-obtrusively, and then there's market research, utilizes varying degrees of customer engagement. That's a little more intrusive because you're asking the customers directly sometimes what they would do, as opposed to just observing what they did without doing something on your own to influence it. Let's start with a really brief explanation of anecdotal evidence. Anecdotal evidence is evidence that's provided on a case-by-case basis from salespeople and marketing managers. It might be a good starting point, but it's really not a good thing to look at in terms of data aggregation. Put simply, anecdotal evidence is what you might observe day to day. Maybe some clients are worried about certain product features, but that's not necessarily a thorough investigation. That's just evidence that you've gotten from a handful of people. So in order to get something more valuable, you want to make sure that you're looking at the larger group, the aggregate, something that's not just based on your personal experience. So again, a more thorough analysis is going to give you data that you can use down the road. Now, there's two types of analysis. There are static analyses, which involve the use of data at a certain point in time. This is great if you're trying to assess people's willingness to buy a product today. There's also dynamic analysis, which looks at the long-term trends in customer behavior. If you're looking at the long-term survival of a company or the value of a product in the long run, you'd want to do a dynamic analysis. If you are just trying to get your product on the market, static analysis might be useful. If you are trying to see how much time you as a company could survive without changing the product, then you'd want to do something more dynamic. Trends, fads, all these things require some dynamic analysis because the static analysis is going to ignore the fact that trends die and fads die. When businesses have been around for a while, typically they keep data on their customers so that they can do their own customer data analytics. This allows them to look at customer demographics to assess what drives people to buy and make certain decisions. However, a lot of times when businesses are trying to do this type of analysis, they don't have data on existing customers. Maybe they're trying to introduce a new product. You can't really make any assumptions about your current customers buying a product that they've never purchased before, or one that doesn't really relate to others on the market. If you still want to base your analysis on observational data, you need to go and consult existing businesses that sell maybe similar products but that aren't quite the same, or you go through some kind of a company that collects data on customer behavior surrounding similar products. But again, that's a little harder to do when you don't have access to the information. Customer data analytics is really useful because it can allow businesses to identify market segments. What is a market segment? Well, a market segment is just a group of people who share some similar characteristics, so we can make decisions based on that group. Customer data analytics can also help businesses determine customers' needs. It reduces churn, it reduces the loss of customers over time, so retaining those customers. It allows them to develop new products and markets. Obviously, if you can determine what drives customer purchasing behavior, you can use that and apply it to new products if there's some similarities. And forecasting potential profits is another motivator. I should have mentioned in the previous bullet, you can take the same things you learn about customers in one place and apply them to customers in another if you're expanding. So that's all for assessment through observation. We can also assess using market research. Businesses can do their own market research, in which case we call it primary research, or they can hire other businesses or consulting agencies to conduct the market research for them, and then we call it secondary research. There are benefits and costs to both of these. If you are a small business, it can be a lot cheaper to pay another company to collect data for you, but those general tools and things that they create that sample customers may not be perfectly applicable to your own company. So there are costs again and benefits associated with hiring outside consultants to do market research for you. Data collection, you can either collect quantitative or qualitative data depending on the objective of your market research. Quantitative data would be data that's number based. Qualitative data would be data that is not number based, things that are based on people's discussion. A lot of qualitative data is anecdotal. Depends on how much you're able to collect and whether you're able to say it pertains to everybody and not just a select few. So there are a lot of different methods for conducting market research. We're only going to discuss a few of them. Surveys, focus groups, and test markets are three of the main ones, and we'll talk about each one of those in turn. So you're all familiar with surveys. Surveys just provide a list of questions that have been developed to get certain information from participants. The goal is to ask a lot of people and be able to aggregate that data up to get averages for some segment of the population. Survey might examine what a person's going to say, what a person says they'll do in a specific situation, rather than observing what they actually do. So it's a stated preference method because we can't actually observe what their behavior is. We're only listening to what they say their behavior is going to be. It's preferred usually to do something that is revealed preference, where we can observe what a customer really does in practice, but very oftentimes it's hard to do that for a hypothetical market. If we're trying to look at whether or not people are willing to purchase a new product, we can't see what they've done in the past because that new product wasn't on the market yet. So we need to rely on stated preference. We'll come back in a minute and talk about some of the main reasons why stated preference surveys and focus groups are not ideal. Survey administration can be really difficult. It depends on the type of customer and buying situation. An online retailer might be best assessed through an online survey because it's easy for them to collect it at checkout. In-person shoppers might be best assessed through handwritten interview-style surveys conducted on site because that's where they are. However, it's very possible to use tools like call-in numbers on receipts to get in-person shoppers to fill out assessments. You could also mail online customers something with the product itself so they could fill it out and return it. You're not required to do it in the medium that the sale or purchase happens. Low survey response rates are an issue. It's important to tailor the survey to maximize participation. So shorter surveys are better, very clear questions are better, and sometimes you might want to incentivize the survey itself. If you can give somebody a prize for filling the survey out or put their name in a raffle, they're much more likely to fill the survey out. So surveys are good for collecting large amounts of quantitative data, but sometimes you don't just want large amounts of data without much detail. Sometimes you want to focus more on the specific experiences of individuals, and in that case you'd probably want something like a focus group. There's a couple different ways to go about setting one up. We're just going to talk about a very general case. Focus group is a small set of potential customers. They usually belong to some similar demographic group, and they're going to meet with researchers or interviewers to go through answers to questions about a product or a buying situation. Recruiting can be tough. You want to make sure that you are really thinking about the types of people that you are putting in these groups, and you want to make sure that whoever you're going to include in the focus group can provide detailed, useful information. You don't want to get people who are shut off. The other part of this that becomes a problem is that the types of people who want to do a focus group are the types of people who are either very excited about a new product. They may not accurately represent potential customers for a product. So that's something to keep in mind when you're putting together a focus group. Both surveys and focus groups, like I mentioned before, might have some biases. The biases that are most important are hypothetical bias. Hypothetical bias is when a survey participant misstates their willingness to purchase a product, for example. We get excited in a survey. You might say that you're willing to pay 2 times as much for this product, but when it actually comes down to it and you're purchasing the product, you really wouldn't be willing to spend that much. So a lot of times, because it's not a real market, people overstate their willingness to pay. Anchoring, or starting point bias, is when the researcher gives you a certain dollar value, for example, asks you if you're willing to pay this, and then they ask you how much you'd be willing to pay, and you've anchored to that number. One of my favorite examples, there was some research that read off Social Security numbers and then asked people to value something, and people latched on to the last 4 numbers of the Social Security number because it was what they remembered most recently. So that's a form of anchoring. I think Daniel Ariely's book talks about that. Information bias, if you don't really understand the goals of the survey, or if you have a different information set than everybody else, that might provide some sort of bias in your responses. There's also sampling bias. I mentioned that in the focus group setting. People who are willing to take a survey or willing to do a focus group might be a different set of people than just a general potential customer. So you might get some bad data based on that. And there's a lot of others, but those are the ones that are the most important to discuss. I have individual slides for each of these, but I'm going to go ahead and skip those here just in the interest of time. And we'll stop and come back and talk about test markets.